All right, so I'll write, Peter, I'll write you a note. Go ahead, Carl.
From Michigan years ago. Yeah, I haven't seen him in forever.
All right. Good evening, everybody.
Yeah.
Welcome to the College of Architecture and Design at Lawrence Technological University. My name is Carl Dobman, and I'm the Dean of the College of Architecture and Design. Sarah doesn't like that I read my introductions, but Sarah's also reminded us all that today is her birthday. So for the... That's what happens when I go off script. We had a few things happening today. We had our 5 Images award ceremony preceding this, so there's at least one family that's here and one prospective student that's joining us for the lecture from the 5 Images Award, so let's give him a round of applause. Martin Schwartz is on sabbatical this semester and joined us tonight, so Martin is with us. And we've got students joining us, and they're not just architecture students. I know we've got graphic design students, industrial design students, and interior students, at least, in the audience with us tonight, so that's exciting. And as you can see from the slide, our college offers a range of design degrees in various scales. So tonight we'll be discussing probably things on the large end of that spectrum about cities and the design of cities and urbanism. So joining us tonight is Gretchen Wilkins. I've known Gretchen for, I think, just about 20 years now. And it's when we were both starting out our teaching careers, both at the University of Michigan. Gretchen began teaching there after completing her MArch at U of M. She then went on and earned a PhD at our MIT University with her dissertation titled Manufacturing Urbanism, an Architectural Practice for Unfinished Cities. And I have to imagine in some ways, either directly or indirectly informed by her time in Detroit. And I'm sure she'll be talking about some of that tonight. At RMIT Melbourne, she founded and directed the Master of Urban Design program, directed the Cities stream in the Center for Design Practice Research, and was coordinator of the Urban Architecture Laboratory. She served as the head of the design department at RMIT University, overseeing the disciplines of architecture, fashion, digital media, and design studies based in Ho Chi Minh City campus. Gretchen teaches and practices, which makes her a great person to include in our lecture series. She's directed collaborative workshops with architecture programs in Europe and Asia. Her design practice includes built work, awarded competitions, international publications, and funded design research. This body of work focuses on contemporary approaches to density, industry, and mobility in rapidly transforming cities. So while I've known Gretchen for a while, it's been a while since we've seen one another. Last year, I was really excited about the news that she was named the 9th head of architecture and the architect in residence at the Cranbrook Academy of Art. She's now our neighbor. After spending so many years on the other side of the planet, now she's again very close. So please help me welcome, and maybe even welcome back, Gretchen Wilkins.
Thank you. It's really nice. Thank you, Carl. That was a really nice introduction. It is really nice to be back. Thank you all for coming. I know this is the eve of your spring break, so I appreciate everyone turning up and seeing some familiar faces from this network around Cranbrook in Michigan and Lawrence Tech and Detroit. It is a sort of strangely familiar feeling to come back and be in this environment again, but in a very sort of different way, and Detroit being in a different stage. So I will talk about some of my experiences, mainly around cities. But I've been, I guess there'll be really sort of like 3 parts. One, talking about 3 cities, Detroit being one that I've spent a lot of time in, and I've started to see overlaps and interesting patterns of how they change. Those cities being Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, Detroit, and Melbourne, Australia. And I think some of that discussion is looking at some of the warning signs of the red flags of happens when cities get in this momentum, really fast momentum of some sort of change. In the case of Detroit, maybe downward decline. In the case of Melbourne and Vietnam, really strong, quick upward decline. And then look at some practices that are resisting that. So that's sort of a theme, I guess, of my interest in my work, is how you develop a practice in an urban way that resists just the sort of strong momentum of more large-scale developer-driven planning, and then show some of my own work which relates to that as well. So Unfinished Cities is the title, which is my interest in trying to keep, I suppose, instead of get cities, think about design and planning of cities in terms of a sort of forward growth or momentum of completion, that actually it's the mechanisms of trying not to finish things that keeps that vibrancy going. And so I'll show some examples of that. This, if you could, probably, I don't know if you can tell, one of my favorite things I brought back with me from Vietnam, which is a metric, imperial, and feng shui tape measure. So you can measure things in all these different ways, which obviously have all different associations, cultural, bodily, spatial implications in different ways. And I just thought it was such a fascinating way of thinking about the way in which we place value on space, and the way in which that then has how that plays out in a strong way in cities. So this was, I don't know how many of you are from Detroit? Most people maybe from Detroit. It might be before your time if you're students here now, but this was in 1998. That was the year, during that year, I moved to Michigan when the Hudson's building was imploded. And it was a very, for those of you who remember or read about it after the fact, it was a very public event. The mayor at the time imploded the building. It was televised. It was celebrated as a Renaissance, Detroit Renaissance. But the building itself was also, as you would know, a very strong cultural icon in the city. A huge site, a department store, obviously, but the site of the Thanksgiving Day Parade, named after it, various sorts of events, a sort of cultural legacy that it had. So when that was gone, this was what the city looked like when I left. So this would have been in 2007-ish, 2008, 2007. And that site, though was supposed to be this, the sign of a kind of rebirth of the city, a new investment in what the city could be, it stayed empty, as you know, for a very, very long time, and looked like this for years, until very recently, when Shop and Bedrock are developing now a plan for its regeneration. So and the city goes from looking like that other image that I showed you when I left to almost the same view now, albeit through a rendering. But I think this is one of that sort of story, and there's, it's a much more complex story having to do with industry and decline of industry, but having to do with a lot of, almost a sort of perfect storm of things happening over the decades of the 20th century that Detroit became so interesting, I think, for people because it was such a rapid transformation, and again is coming back for me now. It's like almost a different city, the way that the development has in fact caught up to that ambition of 1998, 20 years ago. So I've been thinking about that quite a lot, and I got to Melbourne, and Melbourne was not this year, interestingly, for me, because for 7 years in a row, Melbourne, Australia got, and I can't remember who gives this award, but the world's most livable city. It was always Vancouver and Melbourne that were sort of competing for that title. And all of us that were in the design industries were like, I don't know, it's not really, doesn't seem like the most livable city. In fact, there's so much construction happening. These are just some images of right before I left. In this area, in this block, there was about 30 towers, 25 and higher level towers under construction, all within, say, a 5-year period. It just absolutely boomed. And so there was this, there's all these sort of successes of the city in terms of culture and education and design. They often call it the design city. There's some really interesting architecture, really experimental projects. But there was a study done about 2 years ago by someone who was working for the planning department, the architecture and planning department of the city, worried, I guess, about this boom and what it was going to do to the livability, this prized livability that Melbourne always defines itself by, and brands itself quite strongly by. There was this area there's sections of this part of the city that are more dense than Hong Kong, and part of that was because there was very little, if any, regulation, planning regulation, apartment regulation, quality of buildings and quality of living spaces. None of that was really, because it didn't really need to be until this time, none of that was really regulated. So it just took off. So I think what's interesting about that is that, so this is an aerial view for those of you who haven't been of Melbourne and the Yarra River that cuts the two sides of the city, the CBD being on the left, and sort of an extension of the CBD on the right. On the right is where the Crown Casino is, and the big event of the Crown Casino is every night they light these giant fireballs. They call them the gas brigades, and they're just these huge, on the hour, every night. They light these giant things, which people have estimated costs about $20,000 a week, and could fuel a house for a year with the amount they spend in a night of natural gas. But it's just this kind of like overly extravagant display in front of a casino, which, the point of which is to have fun by simply spending money. It's like you couldn't be more extravagant as an urban gesture. Right across the river from that is Flinders Street Station, which is this beautiful old station, a central station for the city. And that's where it's the most visible evidence of the housing problem and the affordability problem in the city. So there's a huge affordability problem in the city, and the homeless rate has increased over, I think it's about 15% in the past 5 years. And so you just get this really strange and very close kind of comparison of not unlike Detroit, the thing that has made the city so successful is also the thing that's undermining it. And that's the common irony that describes Detroit as well. And then, so in Ho Chi Minh City, I think it isn't a city that looks like either of the other two cities, or feels like it's very, very different in terms of its qualities of buildings, and obviously the tropical nature of the city. All of those things are quite different. But it's coming up to this point where there's a massive development. It's like if Detroit was sort of, at this point in a timeline, and Melbourne's like here, and I kept saying, and that's why I think it's interesting this year it didn't win that Livable City Index award, because I think of these things becoming apparent that are problems. That Ho Chi Minh City would be about right here, like just right at this point where there's a massive construction boom happening at the moment. This video is just, while I'm talking, just meant to give you a sense of what the building fabric feels like, what the life of the city feels like. There's this sort of constant, it's incredibly dense, but dense through very narrow buildings called tube houses, like shop houses, not uncommon in Asian cities, with very, very small sort of laneways or hems that run deep into the inner blocks of what the outer, more commercial and residential fabric is like. So it's a very dense city, but very, very fine grain. That's different. That's quite different from what is now happening in the city, which is much more conventional, huge scale master planning developments. That has been happening for probably 15 years or so, but much more ambitiously at the moment. So the discussion about cities and architecture and the relationship of the scale of architecture in cities in Ho Chi Minh City, from my perspective, is again yet another example of how you can think about a sort of resistant model to what's happening in order to keep some of the qualities there that do make it livable, that do make Ho Chi Minh City quite livable. And I think scale generally is one of the things that's the most controllable and deployable and strategic and interesting to work with as an architect working in an urban scale, rather than master planning, thinking about what the sort of ripple effects of a building are and how a building can be resistant to being taken over, or the city being taken over, which I'll show a bit more in a minute. So this is the very typical scale housing and commercial development, which goes all the way back to the French planning, the history of the French tax laws, which taxed based on the width of store frontage or building frontage. And so there's some of the lots are about 6 to 10 feet wide, maybe by 10 meters, 30 feet deep, and then all sorts of heights. And a mix of generations, a mix of uses, a mix of commercial and residential. And then the hems, the alleyways back inside of these blocks where you see this density are some of the most interesting spaces in the city because they're like semi-private, incredibly well kept, but so dense. So you can see the footprint, leaving just enough room, you know, in some cases for 2 people or 2 motorbikes to get by. But then at the upper levels, building that out in ways, and again, you see this in other cities as well, but I think some of the qualities of the buildings here are quite unique. And you get these very, very thin slivers of light. I'm showing these mainly because I think I'll come back to this in some of the new work that I find interesting happening in the city, where these are clues or cues for how to think about an architectural scale design, but in new ways, which we'll see in a second. So, and the alleyways have, again, a mix of residential and domestic space, and all of that density that's happening creates these sorts of mixes of things that traditional planning defies. So traditional planning being more about separating things out and being quite organized and working at a bigger scale. The older parts of Ho Chi Minh City still have these sorts of overlaps of like 1,000 things happening all in like close proximity to one another, like selling steel for construction sites and then selling fish right next door. And living probably right, you know, behind all of this is happening. And so that density, this is just a photo I took on my way home once. I mean, it's just a chaotic density, but somehow because there's not an overarching regulatory system of control, it works. Like it actually runs quite smoothly and fluidly to a point. I think now it's at this tipping point where there's a lot of new development happening, especially in this. So this is all the central business district area. The most dense parts are here. And this was farmland and industry and has now been completely cleared out and is a new master plan by Sasaki, which will look something like this. So the new models of development are very much a kind of imported, so Sasaki, SOM, Singaporean, Japanese planning firms. The model for the new Ho Chi Minh City is quite explicitly Singapore. I don't know how many of you know Singapore, but very, very sort of organized and very new. Everything sort of just, these are greenfield sites, so it's just raising essentially what's there and building everything new. And the architecture is of a sort of podium tower type. Really nothing to do with some of the existing systems of the city that are there, which isn't essentially a bad thing, but it does create problems when those two things come together. Does anyone know who this might be by? You would be right to guess that, but no, it's not by Big. It's by a Vietnamese planning firm. Looks very much like Big's project in Detroit, in New York. So these are these new models. This is all sort of happening right now, which is why I spent about 2 years living there and was traveling there quite a bit before that, and have seen, not unlike how Detroit has changed, Ho Chi Minh City in the past 5 years has changed quite a lot. And the city, this is like one of the main tourist areas of the city, and it's just, you know, a tunnel for the new metro going in right next to somebody's stop, and it's like a very fancy hotel just next to you on the right. Everything is just a bit of a mess, but in a way that makes you feel like there's a sort of potential there. Like, again, this quality of unfinishedness, the more that there's a potential for these, the more that it changes, the more potential there is for new models of architecture at an urban scale to intervene. The sort of irony in the case of Ho Chi Minh City that I find interesting is so as that development's happening, there's an incredible amount of demolition. There's just tarps up everywhere, and a building is literally there one day and gone the next. And you see these phone numbers stenciled onto buildings, which are often demolition companies or construction companies. So they're places where there's a threat or a plan of some new development company coming, and basically it's an advertisement for their company to be the one to take down the older buildings. And there's mixed feelings about this because it's a very practical way of advertising your company, but the people that are residents there don't really like to, I guess, have that as the foreboding future of where they're living. So they'll often, white it out or repaint over it. And so you get these interesting and often quite beautiful sort of stencils on the sides of buildings, but it's like announcing the demise of that section of the city. However, it's been now taken up by artists and become this kind of product. So it's like, it's sort of, I guess, the opposite of Detroit, where the story that people want to tell so much about Detroit is its decline. And it's that thing about the industry that built it is the thing that undermined it, where here it's like the thing that's, the quality of its demise has now become the thing that's going to save it. Like it's become a marketing and a sort of branded condition. And there's many, many examples of this because there's so much retail and commercial and art spaces coming into the city, which is not a bad thing. It's just a bit ironic, the subject matter that it's now displaying as itself. So this is, I think this is an interesting point to think about where architecture, what sorts of scales of building can operate in a resistant mode to what is there. And it's interesting, I think, now because you do get these two scales of the city happening simultaneously. You get the small scale hem and kind of inner laneway developments right next to massive towers or massive infrastructure, or the Bitexco Tower, which is the tallest building in the city and sort of the icon of the city, but next to these really, really informal domestic spaces. This building, 42 Duen Way, is it's actually been in some of the architecture blogs recently. It was the tallest building on this large street that was housing, but then it's now been turned into these like very fashionable cafes and shops, and it's constantly under threat to get redeveloped. But again, the more that it gets occupied and the more it develops its own sort of brand and image, it's that sort of occupation that's actually saving it, because it's an incredibly lucrative site that someone has already purchased. So these people moved in illegally. Like it's the reason they keep giving eviction notices, and the businesses just keep operating. More of them keep turning the housing over to these shops because it's popular and because they can make quite good income from it. But it's just operating at this really precarious point at which any day they could just come in and take the building down. So it's, I think, another example of how those two things, like how you can push back, albeit not with much strength in that case. And so I guess this is this tipping point in my talk where I think some of these things are, there's so much, they're related to inequality, they're related to economic conditions of cities. This is on the West Side Highway in Manhattan, a billboard I saw about 5 years ago. And I thought it was sort of interesting, and started looking up. I don't know if you're familiar with Manhattan Mini Storage ads, but they have all these really sort of clever ads that were, and this one's a bit older, but I thought it was just funny that they're basically they know their audience. Like it's the people of the city, the 99% of the city, the 90% of us that have the smallest, the tiniest amount of space in cities. So we're the ones, obviously, that need storage. They're marketing to the people that the French aristocracy never saw it coming either. Like, we are the masses. We are in control of the city, or could be. We're the ones we outnumber in terms of population, the people of the citizens of a city, but we own such a small piece of it. And this is sort of the situation where 85 of the richest people own as much as 3 billion of the poorest. 50% of the world's wealth is owned by 1% of the population. Like all these statistics that we've heard a lot about through the Occupy movement, through the increase of inequality in cities around the world, and especially in American cities. This is where, and that wealth is space. I mean, it's so you get these kind of moments where the spatial inequality is something that it becomes like this image here. It becomes so easy to just erase that in favor of other models that begin to create a situation that Melbourne's in right now, which is that nobody can afford to live there anymore. So some of these underlying metrics is what I was becoming interested in, and again, just thinking about the space, the thing that we design, the thing that composes the city at some level of density, and how much space is enough. How can we think about the units of space that housing in particular take up? So in all of those cases, say in Detroit, in Ho Chi Minh City, in Melbourne, the house is sort of the thing that we measure our occupation of a city by, whether that's a single family house or a tube house or an apartment in a high-rise development. That has such a strong indication of these questions of livability. So a lot of the work that I've been looking at, both in terms of other people working in the city, in Ho Chi Minh City, and in my own work and in my teaching as well, has looked at different models of housing, different models of trying to think about extreme density with also extreme amenity, for example. How do you start to bring some of the existing ways in which cities work at these finer grains, like the tube house and the hems, together with something that is a more master planned, if you will, development. In other words, not trying to completely resist change at all, but to try to fold in the qualities that between both of those systems, if you will, that makes it a little bit more interesting and livable. So, as an example of an extreme house, I don't know. This is the Antilia house in Mumbai, which is 400,000 square feet for one family with 600 staff. And it's 27 levels, but each level is on average 2 stories. So it's just like it's the most extreme example of this, these questions of how much space does a house need? How much space do we need? And what else could, like we actually, I had students looking at this building in an urban design studio and modeled it and thought about like, okay, well, what are the other things you can do with this sort of space? How could you think about it as almost like a city within the city? But it's an indication of a problem. And that's I guess one of the interests for me is that you may have seen this film called Surviving Progress. It goes through different places around the world and raises this question: how might you? At what point does the thing that is the thing that's working the best becomes the thing that undermines the city? So all of the examples that I gave in those 3 cities, this film talks quite explicitly about like the tipping point between having too much of a good thing or something undermining itself. And I think that's where a lot of cities are at the moment. And it's a matter of saying, what are we doing really well? Well, that thing is the thing that we should actually start to be a little bit cautious about, because it starts to become, in the case of Ho Chi Minh City, the city just starts to become completely sclerotic. Like it's just immutable, and Melbourne's becoming the same. So these sorts of images of so-called nail houses in China, usually in Chinese development or Asian cities, the last holdout of someone resisting a massive development for fair compensation or some compensation, I think is like an index of a question around how you can stand in the way of that momentum of what is good change to a point where it becomes bad change, the tipping point, the surviving progress idea. So then I wanted to just show some examples of architects that are doing this in Ho Chi Minh City in I think really interesting ways, just sort of quickly, because I think there's some really interesting emerging practices there that are taking these questions really intimately, really personally. One of those projects is this Ham restaurant by HB Architects in Ho Chi Minh City. You can see it's just that corner site here on the, sort of in the center of the screen. And they've taken this model of the HEM development, the inner laneway and the smaller housing that really grew sort of over many, many years, but now started to think about how that could be redesigned into an existing site in a new, basically a new site. So it's taking one site, which was probably about 3. You can see it gives a good indication too of the scale of most housing in Ho Chi Minh City, these long, narrow lots. So it's taking probably about 3 or 4 of those lots, combining it together, and then carving it up in an internalized way. So there's still some public space on the outside, but it's basically one restaurant, but it feels like there's about 4 or 5 different restaurants because of the way the interior spaces are carved out, and because of there being, it's a lot of the question, one of the strong questions in their work has often to do with boundaries, how you think about separating or connecting spaces internally, but at an urban scale. And obviously they're doing that through different sorts of color, through thinking about interesting ways of sitting, or where you sit against a wall in a way that it's like all of the cues of the space. It would be better to see it with people in it, I admit. But all of the cues of the space are urban. They're urban. It's like an urban space within the interior of a single building. And this is one of the images that I think relates quite strongly back to those really dense HEM photos that I was showing you before, where it's a series of buildings with just a sliver of light, but they've now, obviously it's one building, so they've put a cover over that so you get light down into the deeper parts of the restaurant. Also by them is what they call the Brick Cave, which is this really, it's a small, again, it's a fairly small site, but they're exploring a lot with this question of boundary. So this is a building within a building where they've taken basically one shape and wrapped the inner building with an outer surface, and you get this gap. I could show you actually in plan. There's the site. You have basically one surface that wraps around itself and then is effectively extruded up. The outside is tipped in a bit, so you get these gaps essentially between the outer shell and the inner shell, which is a way of establishing a kind of privacy. It's a way of allowing light to come in interesting ways. This is that gap space between what is really like the public facade, the urban scale facade, the urban city, and then this sort of almost like a laneway, again, a HEM space that you can wander into, and then the more private inner space of the core of the building, all through brick. Atelier Toa also, I think, is doing some really interesting, actually sort of similar ideas about having a building, in this case, a building over a building. So this is an existing house that they owned outside near a farm, and actually near a mine, and just let it sit for 20 years, and it was just, they hadn't been there, and it was basically falling apart. And so, but they wanted to go back and stay there, so they did a similar thing about putting effectively a greenhouse over the existing building. And so you get these really interesting, again, gap spaces between the outside shell and the inside shell. And there's this common theme of bringing the inside out, or sorry, bringing the outside in, the inside out, and finding a way in which that boundary is quite porous, but it's also one of privacy. And that's not, I mean, these are all, again, sort of reinterpretations of things that work quite well in existing housing. This is like a kind of very common residential building in the center of the city, where you'll have some sort of a screen, a little kind of either balcony or laneway or something that's semi-private, and then the housing next to it. Common in other ways, where you might have there's lots of really beautiful gates, and the kind of world between the city, very thin boundary, but the world between the city and the interior of a site being, very, very different. And then A21 Architects is another firm I've been really enjoying. They're doing quite amazing work in the city, in Ho Chi Minh City in particular. And again, taking clues from things that from the more vernacular fabric of the city, but doing it now in a way that's sort of new, and that allows for a density of, like, they're very narrow sites, so it's a very highly dense development that they often work in, but infuse it with a really high level of density in terms of amenity as well. So this, looking at the existing, this shows it a bit better, but taking this narrow site and chopping it up into like a series of little mini houses, each of them being about, so that's a room, like a house, but a room. And then by stacking them together in different ways in section, you get these gap spaces that are filtering throughout the house. Again, almost like, and they become like the hems, they become like the public space for the family with these private spaces or little houses for each of the family members stacked vertically. So you can tell how narrow it is. I mean, they're incredibly narrow, but they have these sort of, the way in which they let light in, the way in which you get gaps between each of these rooms, it feels much more expansive. And then in a similar project by a different firm, this is actually a kindergarten, but again, taking clues from some of the existing scale of residential development, stacking that together and having, it looks like a slide, it should be a slide. It's a stairway, but it's stacking these together and then using the gap spaces between them as circulation, sometimes using them as classrooms, sometimes using them as playgrounds. And so all of these spaces start to be like both inside and outside and using color and material, in a really interesting way. Finally, I think this is the last project I want to show these are all just sort of examples of what's happening there that I think they're not, they've emerged from a kind of very acute awareness of light, of color, of texture, of spatial and kind of infrastructural sensibilities, but in this very new way. So it's like, for me, they feel very like Ho Chi Minh City, where I've spent the most time, but in a way that is quite new and can be, it could be a new development by one of the larger planners, but it's still keeping some of those qualities and scales of space that you find everywhere. So this is the Mist Hotel, which uses similarly, so these balcony spaces, this space right here, is this space right here. So there's basically two facades. There's the inside facade, which you really can't see from the outside, and then there's this outside white facade with all these interesting grills and cut holes, which you could see here. But it's like the thickness of that is maybe, well, you can see it here, is probably about 4 or 5, sometimes 6 feet, and that varies quite a lot. So that space between the outside facade and the inside sort of inner facade to the rooms, in the hotel rooms, is used for all kinds of things, whether it's a meeting space or a little cafe or a balcony or used for the tub and the hot tub. But again, this is a building from 1971. These are things that you can find in other ways in other buildings, and it's very much a kind of responsiveness to some of the qualities of the city and of the nature of that kind of city, but through a really kind of interesting design sensibility and creative approach. This is the Unification Palace, which is or the Independence Palace, also known as Independence Palace in the city, similarly using this kind of, these filters of light. And again, just very conventional housing buildings usually from 60s, 70s in Vietnam, have other ways of doing that. So it's like, it's reinterpreting some of those qualities at different scales. The other thing that A21 do, this is that same hotel, the Mist Hotel. The other thing that they're really interested in, by way of a kind of, and they're very explicit about their interest in resisting erasing the city. I mean, because what's happening is that so much of it is getting demolished that it's literally becoming erased. They've done whole projects out of fully recycled materials. So they just scavenge around from all these demolition sites and take what they can. So some of this is like basically in the Mist Hotel, it's all of the ceiling spaces. This is one of the little breakfast areas, and all of those materials. It's like this strange kind of collage of things that you would find around the city, but somehow repurposed in a way that feels really fresh and unique, in the way they come together. This is their own studio and gallery, where all of the ceiling and roof materials were recycled from other buildings around the city, in the outskirts of the city, and some of the hoarding and things that are up as construction sites are going up, those things become incorporated. So that's the, where are we with time? Maybe, okay. That's just like a sampling of things that have been happening in the city that I think are both beautiful but also cued into a kind of sensibility of that place, and new, a new form of development. It's like the more that say the 99%, the more that architects can proliferate those sorts of models, the more that there could be, I think, a way of integrating the kind of developer-driven, market-driven development models with these new ways of thinking about housing. And as Carl said, so my PhD was all about these sorts of questions of architecture in the city, very much coming from having been in Detroit or around Detroit and seeing how the city has changed and making these sorts of comparisons to other cities. In particular, I've been really interested in industry and making, and how making is a way, the economies of making, the programs of making, whether it's manufacturing or other forms of like agricultural production, any sort of production of things in the city can be a resistant model of development, because it's usually the thing, it's always the thing that gets pushed outside of the city as the service economies or the knowledge economies come in. And make it effectively homogenized. And that's what Detroit was in the other direction, right? A mono economy of only industry. So finding ways in which manufacturing and making and production can be integrated with the city, with knowledge economies and service economies, with universities, with public space, is something that I've been working on quite a lot in both my own work and in teaching. So some of that is saying, okay, well, what is the architecture of a factory? So one of the projects, a series of projects I've been putting under this banner of Future Factory, is looking at the building type, the factory building type, and how it's transformed from the vertical factory to, excuse me, massive sheds, in that case in China, to robotics, and what the building that doesn't have to have people houses, and how that has an implication in some sort of human way or in some sort of public way, which typically it doesn't, but that's been my interest, again, in that question of boundaries. Like, how do you think about an openness or a publicness to something like a factory building? And again, some of the transformations in how we make things into robotics and into, this is some work my school was doing in RMIT with HoloLens and with mixed reality. And this is, it's also just a recognition that this is already happening in cities. There's a kind of economy of bringing some of these things back into cities as a branding tool to try to think about more diverse and creative populations. Melbourne has certainly been doing this. This is a tram in Melbourne from about 2 years ago, taking in Brooklyn and New York and San Francisco. So taking these sorts of things about making and thinking about it being like a new way of developing a kind of livability and accessibility to the city. So one of those projects I was working on with a couple of colleagues of mine, we called Making Vietnam. And we went and looked at all the different, not all, but many different factory sites around Ho Chi Minh City, the inner very dense central factories that are some of the images I showed you before, those that are on the periphery of the city, and then some of those that were like much further out in the outskirts were more like factory towns. And basically looked at what the prevalent sort of building units, housing units are, and building types are, and map those, and then try to find a way in which these prevalent types of buildings you could start to think about them as a factory type. So instead of taking a traditional factory and saying, what else could you put in it? We were saying, how can you think about what the city fabric already is and integrate factory or production into it? So we looked at residential, informal, and these are things we just sort of observed and made up, industrial building types, how big they were, what they were made of, how you could think about them as effectively a building block. And then we used those to come up with different strategies for production spaces in these different types of city. So the central density, the perimeter area, and then the outskirts. So one of those was taking, for example, the tube house, which are these narrow, tall, and long buildings, and instead of stacking them this way, stacking them like end to end, so they become a wall. And that wall could be something that you could use as a kind of boundary or a buffer between a quite traditional factory building and public space. So it's like you're using residential as this filter between the two that could relate to the two, but doing it in a way that is more like a wall or a barrier. And without going into too much detail, the other one, there were three. The other one that we thought of was this big roof, this idea that shed buildings, factory buildings, often have these it's the cheapest, sort of lightest giant shed. But then under that shed, you could put any number of other building types or any number of other programs. These were more analytical, and then there's some design models that we did. And then similarly, instead of taking the two building, not necessarily end to end this way or as a wall, but we called it street teeth. So it's like just gaps in your teeth, and that you would have a boundary, a sort of a porous boundary between factory space and public space, or urban space and factory space, but allowing other things to fill in the gaps of that space. And so one of those that we tested in these three sites was the big roof idea. So it was basically thinking of the building just as this kind of very light shell that could kind of expand or change shape depending on what it was around. So in the center city, this was an example of what that might look like as a vertical production space. In the perimeter of the city, we thought about it more in terms of these sheds elevated up around, so that the street, a lot of the activity of the street could still happen, but you'd have either residential, factory, and public spaces above in these three sheds, or in a place where you had a lot more space, it could actually start to become much more expansive, again, with lots of things filling in underneath it. So that was a speculative project that we did while we were spending a lot of time, these colleagues of mine, while we were spending a lot of time going back and forth between Ho Chi Minh City and Melbourne. At the same time, around the same time, I started running a series of design studios called Future Factory, where we were looking at, again, the building type of the factory, like what could it be? What is it, and what else could it be? What are the other ways in which you can test some of that, the production of things in residential space, for example, or public space? So this was actually a competition that, I don't know if you remember, the Storefront for Art and Architecture had a competition called the Competition of Competitions, which you had to come up with an idea of what you thought a pressing issue was for architecture and for cities. And so I entered that with this, which was then shortlisted, included in the exhibition as part of it. But it was the Future Factory is the thing that we need to reconsider in terms of urban sites. And so I went through, and a lot of these questions were things like, there were questions to seed what an architectural resolution of that project might be. And that's effectively what then I was in a similar vein running through teaching in master studios and some what we called major project students or thesis students that were interested in this same question. We're taking that on in Melbourne. So looking at sites in Melbourne where productions could start to come back into the city in the denser parts of the city. So these are now student projects, Master of Architecture student projects, looking at factory buildings in Australia in particular, and often generally in Melbourne. Hannah's project was looking, she called it the public factory, so she was very much interested in this idea that you could inject public space or somehow bring the city into a factory in a public way, in a quite big public way, like not necessarily just maker spaces, but how does it actually start to agglomerate other urban programs around it or integrate with programs that are already there. This project was by a team, and they were looking at, often it was they were speculative projects where they would sort of take existing industries or make up industries that they thought were coming, or in Australia, the auto industry has been a very difficult topic because of so many plants that have closed around Victoria. So they were looking at the auto industry and how customization of cars could happen in a very public way, almost in a kind of spectacular way, by the vertical factory now being wrapped around the outside of the building rather than it being historically on the inside, and what that might look like. And then at the scale of the city, this was more of a kind of futurist archigram approach to thinking about the city constantly making itself as it moves through different spaces of development. So it's like the perpetuation of construction is something that's always present, and that the city itself is sort of making itself depending on what sites it is already under construction, and that this sort of brings those together as in a living way. And then finally, this was a major project, a thesis project looking at the port, because it's so, in Detroit being very similar, but it's often those sorts of infrastructural, industrial areas that get taken over into more commercialized programs. So he was thinking about the city, the floating city, I suppose, the idea that you could move these things around and have a space of the city that's constantly basically mobile programs. The other approach to that, so that would be more, those projects were more about making in the city. Then we looked at some, this is through design studios and teaching, that we're looking at making from the city, and this notion, not unlike the A21 projects of recycling building products in the city. This was a project we did as part of the London Festival of Architecture, where we worked with Laminex, and then it was a series of studios. So we worked with Laminex, the laminate material company. We worked, and then also with Astral Plywood, Dunlop Foam. There was an aluminum industry company that they basically, we worked with them as partners. They donated their material, and then we developed ways in which you could repurpose those materials into some sort of a architectural space or a pavilion. And then they all had to be flat packable so that we could literally pack them up and ship them to London, and they were installed in different sites in London as part of the London Festival of Architecture. So this was a few of those projects that were out of Laminex. This one looked at these different, each a little bit different, but units of, it's very, very thin, brittle material. It's almost like nothing you can do with it structurally, except think about it as puzzle pieces or small pieces, units that come together. So this was a series of these pieces that were about this big that then could be constructed into a little pavilion wall. So these were all urban installations, more like urban furniture. This one was same studio, different group, looking at, again, little pieces that then were connected by elasticized connections. So it was stretchy. It was like it was basically a bus stop, a bus shelter that you could lean back on. You'd hang it on a bus shelter and you can lean on it. And it would create like a waiting space in a bus shelter in the city. And they were using the Beatles as their pattern for that. And then this one was a bench that was this concertina pattern of just a series of waffle pieces that could expand and contract, but could then be a space for 1, 2, 3, or 4 people. And it looked a little bit like this. And it wasn't the most comfortable bench because it's pretty sharp. We cut our hands on it quite a lot. But it did work. Like it contracted to about this big, and it would expand out to about 11 or 12 feet, and you could sort of move it around like a snake. Some of the other projects we worked on, the students, these are all, again, all student projects. This was looking at like offcuts of aluminum or steel or some sort of, in this case it was aluminum, and how you could bend them in different ways to create ribs. And then eventually this was like these were pavilion scale as opposed to furniture scale. So it was thinking about how you basically use them to create ribs that then you could put any covering material over that you wanted. And so these were still inside, but they were looking at wire and lighting and different ways that you could integrate systems into just this pretty small scale folded plate structure. Again, at that scale, the pavilion, there was another one looking at offcuts. They always were small units because the idea is like if you're going to reclaim materials, you don't have full sheets of anything. You always have these weird off-cut material shapes. So how do you use that in a system that allows it to kind of fasten itself, at least in this case? So making it lighter, cutting holes on it, those cuts then become the joints to fasten together this triangulated pavilion, which was sort of enough space for about 3 or 4 people with a built-in bench. looked like this. And then the last group of projects is sort of at the biggest scale, which was, okay, well, how do you make the city? And this, I guess, is, as Carl mentioned, so while I was working in overseas in Australia and Vietnam, I set up an urban design program, which was an outgrowth of an area that I coordinated called the Urban Architecture Lab. And that was always, I thought, the much better name, because urban design has this, you know, it has a sort of set of associations with it that it could be many, 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 many things, and therefore nothing at all. But urban architecture was quite explicitly thinking about architects working, or landscape architects working on a kind of discrete project that has an implication for the city, as opposed to trying to think about the whole of the city at the same time, or, you know, a kind of master planning scale. So as part of that, the program was set up. It had 3 cities that you, if you were a student in the program, you did a design studio in each of these 3 cities, which was just quite conveniently where RMIT has campuses. So Barcelona, Ho Chi Minh City, and Melbourne. And so I curated a series of design studios and elective classes and seminars and things that were all trying to get at these different questions of cities that then we could test in the different locations. So we would take, someone we would doing a design studio in Melbourne, and then we would take that same subject matter and look at it in Barcelona and look at it in Ho Chi Minh City. Through these different formats of teaching. So it was an interesting way of setting up a question, but then comparing it, which, you know, I'm very interested in comparing how cities are quite unique individually, but there are so many things that you can learn by looking at the same question in the other, at a different phase of its development, like the intro slide that I was talking about before. So in particular, the one that I guess it was the last, it might have been the last one I did, we called Hem Air. We were looking at high-rise and all of the problems around high-rise. I don't know if you're familiar with this book, which was then made into a movie by J.G. Ballard, but the sort of love-hate relationship we have and people living in cities have with high-rise. It's like we want all the amenities of a kind of domestic scale of living and walkability and the kind of high index of livability, but in a high rise, it's, you know, it becomes, well, I don't want to give up space, or it's a bit too public, or, you know, how do you deal with the lack of privacy or the boundaries? So those were sort of the questions that we put to a series of sites, again, back in Ho Chi Minh City, but really specifically saying, okay, well, how do we take all of those things we were looking at in terms of the HEMS and the tube houses and these different scales, and think about them as a high-rise. And it's not a new question. I mean, there have been lots and lots of studies of vertical cities and vertical laneways and vertical pedestrian spaces, all of that over years. But we thought it was an interesting test, in particular in this case, because it was, you know, explicitly saying, okay, well, a developer needs this many units in this site. It has to have this sort of density, but it also has to have this sort of amenity. And how do you start to bring those things together? So that was these were some of the student projects looking at the combination of these kind of interior and exterior spaces. A lot of the things actually that some of the earlier projects I showed are trying to do, but at a really extreme density. And then lastly, this question of how do you make the city. This was a quite different sort of project. It was a drawing project that was a collaboration that I set up, but then brought for 24 people, 23 other people into. And it was the question was, if you were to draw, like, how do we design cities? How do we draw cities? What information do we need to communicate in order to think about new ways of intervening in cities? Or because we don't actually design a city, right? It's a combination of designing things and building things and then responding to that, and something gets torn down. It's such a kind of unfolding process. If you were to do a construction document set like you do for a building, but for a city, what sort of information would you put in it? Like, what are the metrics of the city that are important? What are the qualities of the city that are important? So it was sort of taking this, again, this thing that we have in an architectural practice, which is communication of information and planning out all of the kind of qualitative and quantitative sets of information in a drawing. How would you do that at the scale of a city? So I started it with a drawing, and then it was in this a book, and the book got mailed around to all these different participants in different parts of the world so that they could look at their city and their practice. So it was mainly architects, but also landscape architects and artists. And they each had to do a drawing, which was effectively a version of a construction document for their city, and then mail it on to the next person. And it went around, it took about a year, starting and ending in Melbourne and going around to these cities around the world. So these are some of the, actually I think this, yeah. It gives you a sense of what the book is. I mean, it was, you know, you had a spread of about 8 by 18, something like that. And it was an accordion book, a Japanese accordion book, that was then filled on the two sides. So this was the drawing I did, which is the one that was used, the other version of which was used for the poster here, which is a drawing of Melbourne, and just looking at the questions of address, like how there's so much in Melbourne about what laneway you live on or what street you live on, and the prominence of that and the sort of identity that people have with different streets and different buildings. And so what if you were to communicate like the metrics of the city and the lineament of the city in a different way? So it resembles the city and it draws the boundaries of the city, but it doesn't actually look like it. Some other versions of that. So this was looking at Istanbul and the pop-up culture that she, in this case, thought was demolishing the qualities of identity of the city. This Jonathan Solomon did Hong Kong when he was still living in Hong Kong. This was Toronto, Mason White, looking at Toronto in a sort of a series of basically machines or tools. Perry Culper, who you might know, who teaches at University of Michigan, did this incredibly beautiful, as you would expect, and sort of laborious, beautiful, layered drawing using gold leaf, and all kinds of notations about alchemic urbanism. You know, Perry and his amazing language. Pablo looking at Pittsburgh and different ways of thinking about perspective, like that these tunnels of vision and perspective is the thing that could effectively, you know, design the city, or you could build the city around these different ways of experiencing it visually. Reet was looking at London in a series of these drawings that she has a whole practice around drawing the kind of abstractions of the spaces of the city. Mireille Rodio, again, who you might know, looked at Paris and the different street signs and stories around those street signs, almost as a puzzle, as a narrative of how you experience your movement through the city of Paris. And then, again, the other version of my drawing of Melbourne. So that's the last project. I think, as Carl mentioned, now being here and working, just arriving back to this part of the world and being, again, still very interested in cities and those sorts of questions, that's been what I'm seeding in the short time I've been here so far, 6 months, but seeding to connect the program at Cranbrook and our students with Detroit. This is our space. For those of you who haven't seen it, you can come by and have a look. But this is, there's the program that I'm interested in starting to shape at Cranbrook has to do with these questions around practice, around making, around cities, and the overlaps between them. And that could take a variety of forms, whether it's fabrication and making in the questions of material, like we were looking at some of those effectively design build studios, or looking at, you know, urban phenomenon, urban works, and thinking about actually engaging some of the projects in the city in a way that's very contemporary and very current to what's happening there now. So we'll see. It's early days, but that's what hopefully you can look out for and come see some of the work that we're doing. It's an interesting place to do it, though, because of the legacy of Cranbrook and making, and the connection and kind of weird actual disconnection between this idyllic paradise of Cranbrook and the city of Detroit. But I think there's some pretty interesting overlaps and also through alumni that can happen. So we'll see. Thank you. If people want to stay, I'm happy to answer questions. Here's a question.
So I know there's a couple of other classes, so some people will duck out, but we've got some time for questions. I see Sandy raising her hand.
Hello. I had a quick question about, I know you hinted at some of the work that the other people you worked with, like Pablo and Rita. What kind of other research methods do you guys do when you're going about urban? Like what is your guys' tactic in diving into it?
Observation is the main thing. Observation, and then from that, different forms of documentation of the city. That's why that project was interesting to me, because there's this thing that, I mean, I talk about it in any sort of teaching, but you know, the way that you draw something implicates the way that it's made. And so how you think about design, how you make stuff that is communicating design, you know, has residual effects in what something is. So I think, excuse me, the same is true of cities, that what you see it basically shapes how you intervene into it. So I talk a lot about and enjoy and practice myself, you know, just tools of observation. What do you look at? Like forcing yourself to look at things that, that's why I think the qualitative, quantitative thing is really interesting, because if we look at cities only in terms of their, the physical metrics or the spaces, what we can measure in the, you know, back to the original slide, what are the ways in which you measure it? Do you measure it through what units? Is it small scale or urban scale? Is it feng shui and qualities of, you know, life? Like, I think the way that as a first sort of pass, the way that you get to a place and just absorb it and then communicate it through different notations, through different media. For me, that's just, it's like forcing yourself to not see the things that you usually see and to see it in a different way.
Hello. So in the 3 cities that you focused on tonight, what did you observe in terms of the status of this resistant architecture in the various places? Like who's behind it, who's making it move or not making it move?
Yeah, it does depend a bit. I mean, I think in Melbourne, there's such a, it actually has a really engaged city planning office they have a state government architect and a city architect, like an official position for an architect at the city level and at the state level, which is interesting, I think. And there's a lot of investment in design, and there's just a lot of architects. So I think it is really being driven through developers, but working closely with architects. So it seemed to me that there's more connection between design culture and development culture there than there has been from my experience here in the US, which is promising, but it's still driven by money, and there's a lot of money. So that's where I think this massive boom of towers, which isn't a bad thing in and of itself, except that it happened so fast and without any oversight. So that is developer driven. And in Ho Chi Minh City, I guess the resistant mode that you mentioned, that is a very, very grassroots. It's a state planning, national, I guess, planning. Like in many Asian cities, it's run at the government level, and architects work as architects, and all of the planning industry is really within a government office. And so the discussion among architects and those that are working in those sort of design fields is very much, I mean, it's resistant in the language, like there's a lot of discussion about it in small ways in cafes or in lectures. But there's a real fear, I think. The architects that I know that are working there and doing these beautiful projects are, you know, you just have to kind of put your head down and do it. But there is a real fear, and reasonably so, I think, that all of the things that made it so livable are just being erased. So it's happening through these small scale projects, really, through architects and the private clients, not so much the government and city planning offices.
So how about one more question? Because I'm realizing with all of the events that were going on before, we never got you any water. So at a certain point, you're not going to be able to answer that many more questions. So how about one last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Hello.
Hello.
So kind of directly related to the question of livability, considering what's happening environmentally and the impacts that like we're kind of having on the planet and predictions of a 2 to 4 degree increase in like world global temperature, how prepared do you think cities are to react to those types of new realities that are going to come about? And do you think that there's a specific city in mind that kind of is a model that we should be following in the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's I guess most fresh on my mind in the case of Ho Chi Minh City because they're really, like, as you could probably tell, it's very flat, it's very low, it's very watery, and there's a rainy season. And so in the rainy season, you know, I've had to cross rivers, which were once streets, to get places. Like, it just floods. It's really, it didn't always flood so badly, though, and it's because there's these different forms of development which aren't, the ground isn't nearly as porous, there's not as many places for it to go, the water to go. So it's a really serious issue there. And I think the ways in which they're trying to deal with it, one of the main ways actually is through pollution control. So not really much you can do about maybe the temperature change that would cause some of these things to happen, but there's a lot of these different sorts of either grassroots or increasingly so officially launched programs of pollution control and of recycling, actually pretty far ahead of even Melbourne or coming back here, some of the cities here, because it's so pressing. And again, that's often when those things happen, is like you just can't ignore it anymore. You can't actually move through the city. There's, you know, it's gonna, the water table is just gonna rise so high. So a lot of the city was originally canals, and they've often mostly gotten filled in with just absolute, like they're just trash heaps. I mean, it's pretty dirty. But increasingly over the past probably 5 to 8 years, there's city implemented planning programs to clean those up and to let them be watery again, and all kinds of programs to, you know, clear up the streets and things like that. So I think it's definitely, well, the other thing that relates to, I guess, is all the questions around mobility, how you move around the city. So Ho Chi Minh City is putting in an underground transport system, but it's mired in all kinds of conflicts and political issues, so it probably won't. It's a race between because the economy is booming as well, so a lot more people are moving from motorbikes to cars, which is also why it's so congested, because it just can't take the bigger vehicles. And so, and then there's the metro going in, so they want to get to a point where not everyone gets wealthy enough to own a car, because when you own a car, you're never going to go back to using public transport again. So so mobility is something that it's just been either locked down or it's going to be, again, like mobile and porous. But those two things, I think, are the real key issues.
Thank you, Gretchen.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.